Well, I'm Kerry Hodger-Brathcan, and I'm in the second year of my PhD at the University of Manchester. I began in September 2020, but I'm currently part-time. I'm being supervised by, as you can see, Dr. Sarah Peters, Dr. Patricia Gooding, and Dr. Anya Witkowski. And so the title of my PhD project is Developing Participant-Informed Methods for Acceptable and Safe Research into Suicidal Experiences. And I know the title of this room is Depression and Suicide, but just in terms of content warning, I do talk about suicide quite a lot throughout the slides, just to be aware. So first of all, I would like to give you a very brief overview of the project, the studies that are planned and the overarching aim. I want to talk about the participant population I've chosen to focus on and the rationale for that. I'm going to highlight some of the gaps I've identified in the literature and subsequent research questions. And then I want to talk about the first qualitative study I'm about to undertake and the methods I'll use. Right, okay, so the overarching aim of my project is to produce guidance to inform research, conduct and design in suicide research that is appropriate and acceptable for the participants we ask to be involved. There are 4 studies within the project, systematic review, which is currently ongoing, 2 qualitative studies, the first of which I'm going to talk about in more detail today, and finally a Delphi study, which will be informed by the findings from the previous studies. I just want to say that patient public involvement and engagement has been really important from when the project was first conceived, and I'm really fortunate that I've been working with an expert by experience, and they're very committed to helping me with plan and design lots of aspects of the studies. Okay. So I'm focusing on the perinatal period and suicidality here. To define that further, I'm referring to from conception and throughout pregnancy and up to 12 months post-birth. This quote that you see here is in reference to something known as the Embrace Report, and that stands for Mothers and Babies Reducing Risk through Audit and Confidential Inquiry in the UK. They're produced every 3 years and look at maternal mortality cases. And this quote is 2017 report, which highlights that sadly suicide is the leading cause of death in the perinatal period, and that was also the case for the 2020 report. So this does bring into question.
Can you hear me?
What?
The breakout rooms are running. See which room would you like to go to, Karen? Okay, I'll just.
Sorry, Stuart, we can hear you in our breakout room. Can you?
Your full name, Karen, is? What? No, it's.
Sorry about this. Stuart?
Oh, here we go. So you want to go to depression and suicide?
Yes, please. I was on earlier, but for some reason I put off. Sorry about that.
Stuart?
So if you go to the breakout rooms, you can go to join. All done? Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that, Kerry.
No problem. Shall I carry on?
Yes.
I'm going to try to mute Stuart. Just give me 1 second.
I've just done that. I've muted him.
Okay, perfect. Right, thank you.
Right, I'll carry on. Sadly, it is a leading cause of death in this period, and there has been sort of a contention that maternity has a protective factor against suicide, but this is perhaps more complex than it seems. Okay, so much of the research in this population about suicide has been about prevalence, risk factors and correlates of suicidality, with some important findings that, for example, suicidal methods tend to be more violent in perinatal women than in non-perinatal women, and also that the perinatal period is a particular time of risk for women with severe mental illness. You can see from this sort of long list of risk factors of suicidality that, as with other populations, in the perinatal period, there are numerous factors often at play, and they can be quite complex too. To move on and talk about suicidal ideation, to define the term, obviously it's one that's widely used, but can cover a spectrum of phenomena, from somebody having fleeting thoughts of not being here through to somebody who might have persistent ideas of ending their own life with serious intent to do so and a plan. Obviously it's a burden for the individual, but it's also associated with the strongest risk factor for suicide attempts too, and also with negative outcomes for children in terms of poorer mother-infant bonding and negative outcomes for emotional and cognitive development. Suicidal ideation in the perinatal period is more prevalent than in non-perinatal women. A recent meta-analysis found that it had an 8% occurrence in perinatal women versus 4.8% in non-perinatal women. And interestingly, this was moderated by the type of assessment tool used to measure suicidal ideation. And this is perhaps some of the explanation as to why, for example, you can see in pregnancy it's been found to be between 33%, because there is such a wide variation of measures that are used to look at suicidal ideation research. But however, in the perinatal population, most commonly depression screens, such as the Patient Health Questionnaire and the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale. Now, both of these scales use a single question to inquire about suicidal ideation, and you can see those in the box on the screen. So the PHQ-9 asks, over the last 2 weeks, how often have you been bothered by any of the following problems? Thoughts that you'll be better off dead or of hurting yourself in some way. And the EPDS inquires about the last 7 days. The thought of harming myself has occurred to me. And this can be problematic for several reasons, asking this sort of question on a depression scale. As you can see, they're worded quite differently and may offer limited information about the suicidal ideation that person is experiencing, and isn't recommended to assess suicidality using a single item only. Women may have suicidal ideation but may not be experiencing depressive symptoms. So in a clinical setting, they may not even be screened for suicidal ideation if they're not screened for depression. So the gaps identified were that there is a lack of empirical population and also a lack of suicide-specific measures being used both in clinical and research settings. And we might find it difficult to involve more women directly in suicide research if we don't understand how to ask about them, how to ask them about their suicidal experiences and how to support them in doing this. So on that basis, the research questions I identified for the qualitative work are validated suicide measures appropriate for use and acceptable to women in the perinatal period? What's the impact of taking part, and how can researchers optimise their well-being when they do take part? There are 2 qualitative studies planned under this title you see here at the top, and I've highlighted the word women because this is the first study and it focuses on the views of women as opposed to healthcare professionals. Acceptable brief self-report suicide measures are in perinatal populations, and to look at the impact of participating. I plan to recruit a sample of 40 women who are currently in the perinatal period and have had suicidal experiences at some point in the past, and I'll recruit through NHS services, or women might self-refer into the study. So I'll put this up here just to give you this figure to show you how we plan to collect the data. So 2 time points. The first time point, we're going to use a procedure known as the 3-step test interview, which was conceived to test questionnaires. It's composed of 3 different steps: a concurrent think aloud, a follow-up interview, and a semi-structured interview. And I will go into more detail about those on the next few slides. 1 week later, I'll send out an online survey to collect qualitative data. This is to explore how the participant felt since taking part in the 3-step test interview, to look at the impact of participation. Okay, so the concurrent think aloud is the first step in that 3-step test interview. And this is where we'll ask participants to complete 4 different brief suicide self-report measures. As you can see them listed at the bottom of the slide. They are between 4 and 6 items long, so quite brief, and they look at different dimensions of ideation, behaviour and intent. And we'll also ask them to do the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale at the same time. Now in this, what happens is they complete the measures, it's audio recorded, and we ask them to say out loud what they're thinking as they're doing this. The researcher observes, perhaps takes notes, but doesn't interact with the participant. And to give you an idea of how that looks and what it should look like in practice, I've used a couple of examples from doing some piloting with an expert by experience. So one of the measures asks, one of the questions asks, in the past month, to what extent have you felt tormented by thoughts about suicide? And in our piloting, the participant read the question out loud, thought, and said, tormented, the thoughts weren't causing my distress, they were actually the source of comfort. One of the questions on the EPDS states, I've been anxious or worried for no good reason. And here the participant said, well, I'm sure it felt like there was a good reason at the time. So this hopefully gives you an idea of the type of data we hope to elicit from carrying out this exercise with participants. So following that, step 2 is a follow-up interview, and this is a brief step, and it's simply filling in any gaps that we may have found from looking at from the first phase. So retrospectively asking, for example, if something wasn't clear, perhaps the participant might have paused for a long time. We're just filling in any gaps in that data. And then the final step at this time point will be the semi-structured interview. Here I'll use a topic guide to probe more deeply about the experience of completing the questions, thoughts about the specific questions, perhaps the language that was used, how relevant the participant felt these questions were to their own experiences. And that concludes that data collection point. And as I said previously, a week later, we send out the online survey to look at the impact of taking part in the preceding week. So in summary, ethical research methods ought to be appropriate and acceptable for the participants we ask to be involved. And sadly, suicide is a leading cause of death in perinatal women, but there is a lack of empirical suicide research in this population. This qualitative study will investigate using suicide questionnaire measures with this population, and we hope to begin recruitment within the next few weeks. And hopefully with the other PhD work, we'll highlight what's appropriate in terms of methods and practices to use in perinatal suicide research. Thank you for listening, and thank you to Mental Health Research UK and to my supervisors for their support, and any questions I'm happy to answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Kerry, and well done about getting through the interruption. So would you perhaps you could take your slides down? Would that be okay?
Yeah.
So we've got about 5 minutes for questions. Please use the hand, the automatic hand under reactions. I wanted to ask the first question, if there's no other questions, and that is, do you know what proportion of women in the perinatal period who become suicidal have severe mental illness?
No, I'm afraid I don't know the statistics on that, unfortunately. But we do know that looking at the sort of the research that's been done, they are by far the highest risk group of women who may go on attempt.
And to be clear, though, the methodology that you're aiming to develop is for research in the first instance, rather than for clinical application. Is that right? Yes, and I think the thing is, it felt as though the two had to go hand in hand in terms of when we looked at what's going on clinically. It seems that research, it can't. The two go hand in hand. Obviously, as you know, we can't ask women if it's not been talked about in clinical settings. In terms of from primary care, from midwifery perspective, then it sort of needs to go hand in hand. Really, being able to ask those questions in both settings. Yes. But yes, primarily for research purposes. Claire, you have your hand up.
Yes, Kerry, I really enjoyed that presentation, so thank you very much. You mentioned that in terms of recruiting participants, that women could self-refer, and I wondered how that was going to happen, how they would know about the study, etc. So could you just explain that a little bit?
Yes, of course. Yeah, we plan to advertise in posters within the clinical settings as well as through clinicians. So they may just see them and sort of jot down, have a look at the details, and then self-refer without going through their healthcare professional. We also plan to advertise on parenting forums. So there's an advert will be placed on those to look at any women who may be interested, and perhaps contact with maternal mental health charities.
Nala.
Oh, hi, Kerry. I'm
Hi.
another one of the MD Res or of the MHR UK scholars. But yeah, I thought that was really very interesting. And I've done some work in perinatal mental health. And yeah, I just, again, thought it was excellent. And I've never come across the sort of Think Aloud pilots before, which is really interesting. But my question was about whether you foresee that you might, coming out when you come through this part of this particular study, do you think that you'll be in a position to make recommendations in terms of adapting measures for women in the perinatal period, or recommend new measures? Or so what do you foresee as the recommendations you might be able to make? Obviously, you've not done the work yet, but just thinking ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yes, I mean, I would hope that it might be, recommendations certainly. Obviously, we're a little bit of a way off the development of new measures. And I think there is some work ongoing actually, where people are looking at perhaps, because it is something that comes up time and time again, that the measures just aren't there or they're not being used. And I think from the work that I'm doing, recommendations certainly, and I think really looking at the overview of the PhD, that is the overall aim, and we might be able to pick out sort of certain factors or certain types of language that we might be able to use, or what that might be relevant in the perinatal period that may not be relevant within other populations. So I was a bit awfully, I don't know.
I think that for the non-clinical people here, it might. I mean, and I may have got this wrong, but I think it's worth contextualizing this. I mean, childbirth is supposed to be a happy period, and often women who have just given birth are often usually being managed by nurses and midwives. And the question, I think some of this is about finding ways of making it acceptable for them as well as the patient, and finding the right language to approach. Absolutely. Things that might, to many people seem right out of left field at that, at the time of life, and that's what you're trying to. That's the challenge that you've set yourself, and that's why it's important work.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's spot on, because and which is why we really thought it was important to carry out that second study with healthcare professionals. Yes. And so I've done some piloting with healthcare professionals. And I think there's going to be some, some really interesting data around that and how it's approached, because it does need to be within a conversation between those two people, as well as, before we can bring it into research settings.
Yes. Okay, any more questions? Okay. Well, that was great. Thank you very much. And once again, well done. It was a very good talk and under difficult circumstances, but it'll prepare you for presenting at conferences where people stroll in and out at all inconvenient times and answer their phones and all sorts of antisocial things. Okay, so well done. Alexandra Schmidt is the next speaker from University of Sussex. So Alexandra, I'm trying to locate you in the wall of faces. Oh, there you are. Hello. Would you like to put up your slides?
Yeah.
Is your supervisor here, Daria Gazina?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Yeah. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can see you.
Thank you. It's welcome. Good morning, everyone. So thanks very much for organizing this conference. I remember last year it was a great success, so hopefully it goes very well this year as well. So today it's my great pleasure to introduce Alexandra, or Ali Schmidt. So Ali is working on her PhD project at the University of Sussex under my supervision, as well as under supervision of two clinical psychologists, colleagues at Dr. Clara Strauss and Dr. Nick Gray. And So Ali is in her third year, and during the past year, so she's been working on setting up a new study using the data or collecting the new data at the RAPT services, improving access to psychological therapist services. And today, Ali is going to present a progress report on this study.
Thank you. Great.
Okay,
Thanks, Ali.
right. So hello, everyone. So my name's Ali. As Daya mentioned, I'm in my third year of my PhD at the University of Sussex. And today I'm talking to you about the study that I'm planning to run in the NHS Talking Therapy Services, IAP, to look at predictors of psychological treatment outcomes for older adults. So just to give some context here, older adults are defined as anyone as 65 or over, but of course I appreciate this the long period of life still after that time, but this is for purpose of definition, this is the definition of older adults in this study. Okay, to give some background, so common mental health problems like depression and anxiety are highly prevalent in older adults, with around 20% of the older adults suffering from one of these conditions at the time. This is exacerbated by the pandemic and also recent reports that there seems to be some concern around the ability of older adults to bounce back from the effects from the pandemic. So therefore it's a really important topic right now. Psychological treatment is successful, but the evidence for older adults is mixed, and overall the recovery rate is around 50%. So there is some room for improvement. To identify factors that can predict treatment outcome could allow for adapting existing treatments or develop completely new treatments for people where existing treatments might not work. So we've carried out a systematic review of existing literature and identified 28 treatment outcome predictors, for which I've recently submitted the manuscript. To give a bit of background on this review, so there's some highlights. So one of the most consistent predictor of positive treatment outcomes was homework completion. So homework, not in the traditional sense. This is more like mutually agreed tasks that the patient will carry out between sessions. So when these were complied with or completed, this consistently predicted better treatment outcomes. Baseline symptom severity was extensively studied across a lot of conditions and treatments, but there were some contradictory findings, with some studies finding higher symptom severity predicting worse treatment outcomes, and other studies finding higher symptom severity predicting better treatment outcomes. So there is some inconsistency there. And lastly, there were some factors that never predicted treatment outcomes, such as gender, income, or physical conditions. Across the 36 studies that were included in the review, there was a high variability in findings, a lot of mixed and inconsistent findings. And overall, the research appeared to be quite exploratory at this point, with 40% of factors having only been reviewed by one study and therefore requiring replication. Overall, there was a lot of studies with very small sample sizes. So more than 2/3 of studies had fewer than 100 participants, which could mean that some factors could actually not be identified because the studies were underpowered to find any effects. And lastly, there seems to be a high focus on CBT as a treatment type and depression and generalized anxiety disorders, and very few studies looking at other types of treatments or other conditions such as PTSD or obsessive compulsive disorder. So with all these limitations in mind of the existing research, what we want to do with this study is look at what are the predictors of psychological treatment outcomes in the IAPT services. And secondly, whether these factors affect treatment outcomes differently for older and working age adults. So in terms of participants, we're looking to recruit 700 participants, ideally split between evenly between working age and older adults. The inclusion criteria, therefore, is quite broad. So we're looking for people aged 18 and above that have been offered treatment in the IAPT service in step 2 or step 3. So step 2 is more for lower intensity therapy, and step 3 more higher intensity, such as CBT. This slide is to show how the participant journey will look like when they take part in our research. So the process starts with an initial assessment in the IAPT service, where when they then get accepted into the service, they will be invited to take part in our study. So this is whilst they're awaiting the actual start of their treatment. So we will ask them to complete a baseline questionnaire. And once they have done that, they will just continue awaiting the start of their treatment, then go through their treatment. And then post-treatment, we will ask the IAPT services to provide us with post-treatment data, such as symptom severity before and after treatment, what type of treatment the patient received, and how long for. The possible treatment outcome predictors that we're looking at, they have been informed by the systematic review that we've been through and are across a number of domains. Psychosocial, looking at people's experience of life events and associated coping style. Clinical aspects such as the symptom severity at baseline, or whether they have any concurrent medical conditions. Treatment related, so what type of treatment they received and how long for. Socio-demographic information such as their education. And then also some factors that have not previously been studied as predictors, but have been associated with mental health outcomes. So we want to see whether these factors, some of which are also modifiable, may be also predictive of treatment outcomes, such as self-compassion, resilience, or loneliness. The outcome measures we're looking for, they're routinely collected in the IAPT services and are relating to the symptom severity of the specific condition that the patient is experiencing. So for example, the patient health questionnaire or the generalized anxiety disorder assessment or any other anxiety disorder specific measures. The primary outcome is recovery as per the IAPT definition. So in IAPT, people are assessed in terms of whether they are at caseness, which means that whether their symptoms are severe enough to be considered a clinical case, and whether they then have recovered after treatment from this status is the primary outcome. As a secondary outcome, we're also looking at a continuous measure of change in symptom severity, which would also be interesting, especially for the people that have just gone above the threshold, maybe to reach caseness, but might not have improved that much overall. So that's why we're looking at the secondary measure. In terms of the analytical procedure, so initially we'll be looking at calculating recovery status for each of the participants, and then looking at the association of treatment outcome of individual predictors. And for any predictors at this point that were significant or seem to have a significant effect, they would then be put into a larger model where we're looking at multiple factors simultaneously to see if in the presence of other factors, these factors are still important. And then we'll be looking at assessing whether the factors affect the outcomes differentially for the different age groups. And then lastly, or like as a second analysis, we'll also repeat these steps for the secondary outcome of change in symptom severity. So here's a brief overview of the activities to date and what is planned next. So in spring and summer last year, I created the research documentation, such as the research protocol, and patient-facing information, such as the patient information sheet, consent form, and any recruitment materials. Throughout this process and ongoing, we've worked with PPI groups who've given me actually really valuable feedback in terms of how to make the materials as patient and participant friendly as possible. And yeah, this has been really helpful to move the project forward. In October last year, I obtained the pre-sponsor and sponsorship approval of the university, which then paved the way for approaching NHS ethics committees for approval, which I obtained in January this year. And the study was also adopted into the NIHR portfolio, which has been really is great news, because this allows us now to work with IAPT services nationwide to see if we can roll out the study there. In terms of recruitment and engaging sites, so this has started from February and will be ongoing until the end of this year. So I've been working extensively with Sussex Partnership Trust to get the recruitment going, and have also been in discussions with other IAPT services to see if we can roll out the study there. So recruitment will be ongoing until the end of this year. And then in spring next year, I will be asking the IAPT services to extract the data from their systems, which will then be fed into the data analysis that I mentioned previously. And then we'll work on writing up and sharing the findings in summer next year. So this leaves me to say thank you to Mental Health Research for UK for making all of this possible in the first place, and also my supervisors, Dr. Daya Gaisina, Dr. Clara Strauss, and Dr. Nick Gray, who've been really supportive in helping me with this project.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Ali. Great. Would you like to take the slides down? That's great. If anyone has any questions, then they could put their hand up. We already have several hands up. And then, all right, Kate Bailey, you're first on my list.
Great. Oh, thank you so much. I'm really, really pleased to see this study. So I'm an old age psychiatrist, and I think we know from previous kind of work in IAPT that actually older adults do really well once they're kind of engaged with IAPT, and actually better than working age adults. But I guess one of the questions I had is about the access to IAPT in the first place, because I guess my experience of referring older adults is that if there's any sort of issues with sort of frailty, cognitive impairment, communication difficulties, that they can't kind of work with IAPT in the first place. So there's a group of people who kind of can't do things over the phone, or so I guess I just wondered, that's obviously not possible to study in this study, but if there were any thoughts about kind of how to capture sort of those people's experiences, because I think working with the CMHTs for older adults, one of the big, I suppose, subjective predictors of outcome is actually flexibility of the service in order to be able to go and see people at home and work with people who might be in and out of the acute hospitals or might have cognitive impairment. So it was just a kind of question about that. But yeah, thank you for doing this work.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the really good question, actually. I agree. I think the access to the service is something that is of my concern as well. And also with the pandemic, even thinking about access to technology to still have therapy within the services. So I think, yeah, I unfortunately, I can't really address this in my research right now, but that would definitely be something maybe post PhD that I could extend and maybe look at, you know, in further studies. But yeah, I agree. It's definitely of concern.
Are there any that I saw a sort of fleeting phantom hand earlier on, but it seems to have disappeared. I have a sort of slightly related question, which is that Kate mentioned cognitive function. Now as a member of your target population, I can tell you that cognitive function does begin to deteriorate. But actually, also comorbidity with physical disorders increases hugely in the 60s and 70s. And are you planning to look at that as an outcome, as an outcome predictor? I have no data on this, but you would predict that, say, some chronic disease might well affect outcome.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. Interestingly, so I thought this would be the case as well. From the systematic review, it appears that this was not a predictor of outcome, but as I mentioned, I think because there were quite a lot of studies that were very underpowered to find effects, that might be one of the reasons. But yes, it is something that I'll be asking about in the questionnaires about any physical long-term conditions that the patient may suffer. So I want to look at that again, absolutely. In terms of cognitive impairment, also actually from the review, it appears that a lot of the cognitive measures did not predict outcomes. So this was actually studied quite extensively, but apart from some cognitive flexibility measures, none of them seem to predict outcome. And that was something that I had originally planned to look at as well in this study, but because of the difficulty trying to do these tests remotely, I had to drop that in the end. And that maybe is also something that once we can maybe take measures again face to face, that might be easier to do again then, but to set this up remotely seemed to be really difficult. So yeah, that's why I haven't included it in this newer study, but that's definitely something still on my radar.
Right, thanks. Any other questions? Okay, well, oh yes, one more, Claire.
Yeah, I mean, you're hoping to recruit, I think you said 700 participants, which is a big ask. But I just wondered what the proportion of people entering the IAPT service were in your kind of working age adult group, and what proportion were in the older group.
So yeah, the proportion of older adults is much lower. It's between 5 and 10%. So yes, it will be harder to recruit from this age group. But I think the fact that we can hopefully work with several IAPT services will make it somewhat easier to reach the recruitment target. But yes, it will certainly be a bit challenging.
Okay, but the fact that you've got it approved on the NIHR as an NIH by the NHR should help greatly with that, I would have thought. But it's great to see an ambitious, large study in this important area. So yeah, well done and great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Niamh McSweeney, and Niamh, you're here, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm here. I'll just share my screen if that's okay.
And I think, did I see Heather Wally?
Yep, I'm here. Yeah.
Hi. Heather, hi. So will you do us an intro,
Yes.
please.
Yes,
Thanks.
of course. So hello, everybody. Good morning. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Niamh this morning. So Niamh started with us at the University of Edinburgh in 2018. So she's in her final year this year. And she's coped admirably with all the chops and changes that have had to happen because of COVID. She's a real pleasure to supervise, and I'm not sure if she's going to speak today about her passion for open science as well as her interest in her research. So I'd just like to mention that Niamh was awarded a highly commended prize by the British Neuroscience Association Credibility Award for her work in open science and reproducibility. So well done to Niamh for that. And yes, I'll just pass over to her to give her presentation. Thanks, Niamh.
Great, thanks very much, Heather. So yeah, hi, my name is Niamh. I'm a final year PhD student. This is my last Scholars Day. So today I'm just going to give an overview of the work I've done to date in my PhD, and I suppose focus more on the research that I have undertaken in the past year. So it might be a bit of a whirlwind, but I'll try and stick to time and kind of talk you through what I've been up to. Okay, so the overarching aim of my PhD is to understand the biological and psychosocial factors associated with adolescent depression. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into too much background information on kind of adolescent depression, but just I think there's kind of two main things that would be good to keep in mind. So first of all, adolescence is the time in our lives when we're most vulnerable to the onset of depression. And we know that depression is one of the leading causes of illness and disability in young people. And then secondly, during adolescence, the brain undergoes dramatic changes. So they reckon that adolescence is actually this second period of kind of heightened brain development, and the brain is changing as much as it is in kind of the newborn phase. So it really is a time of flux. And I suppose I'm approaching understanding adolescent depression with both of these things in mind. And that's very much shaped the approaches I've taken in my research. So my research is kind of broadly split into two main strands. So the first two are data analysis-based projects, and these emerged because of COVID. So actually prior to that, I was going to do an entirely data collection-based PhD, but that changed quite quickly when COVID happened. So I've been working on two studies with the ABCD data set, and then a third study looking at irritability in adolescents. So all of these adopt very much a neuroimaging lens and trying to understand the kind of root of depression in the developing brain and how that associates with biological and other psychosocial factors. So I'm going to kind of discuss each of these today. So just to give a bit of background so people know what kind of data I've been working with. So ABCD is a study based in the States. It stands for the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study. It's an absolutely fantastic resource, and it's available to all researchers. And it's a population-based study that is longitudinal. So they've recruited nearly 12,000 young people across the US when they were 9 and 10. And then they're going to follow these young people for the next 10 years. And they've tried to make the sample as demographically diverse as possible, which is super. And they've collected a host of variables. So they have neuroimaging data, and then an array of mental health, social and environmental data. So it really is a wonderful resource to the field, and will hopefully help us better understand the factors that shape development. So the first project in my PhD was looking at brain structural associations with depression in adolescents. And I'm going to just kind of briefly talk about this project because I went into quite a lot of detail at the last meeting. But just as an update, this paper was published in eClinical Medicine in November. And this is a project that I led with a postdoc in our group. And just to kind of summarize the main findings of the paper. So we were interested in what brain structures were associated with depression in adolescents, and whether or not this kind of related to the findings that we see in adult samples. And broadly speaking, we found that there were very similar findings to those seen in adult samples, so decreased cortical volume, as well as differences in white matter microstructure. So these are kind of the connections between different parts of the brain. So we see similarities between the two samples there, but also some notable differences, especially in terms of surface area. And these findings suggest that neuroanatomical differences may be present early in the disease course. So even though the young people that were kind of involved in kind of this, or the data that was available for this analysis, the young people were only aged 9 to 11, so at the very early stages of adolescence. So this study definitely paves a lot of ways forward to study whether or not these brain structural associations change over adolescence or how they might develop. So definitely a lot of exciting avenues to follow up on there. So the second project that I've been working on in my PhD in terms of the ABCD work I've been doing relates to brain structure as well, but looking at pubertal timing and how that relates to an increased risk of depression. And this project emerged out of the research that we did in Project One. So just as kind of a brief background to kind of puberty and how it might relate to mental health risk. So we know that earlier pubertal timing is associated with higher rates of depression in adolescents. And beyond age-related changes, so as I mentioned earlier, we know that the brain undergoes dramatic change during adolescence. We also know that pubertal development specifically is associated with changes in brain areas related to cognitive control, emotion regulation, making. However, we're kind of where brain structure might be coming. So this is your pubertal development relative to your peers, and practice the aim of that study, which I've been working on for the past couple of months. So I'll just briefly kind of walk through the methods of the study. So this project is a registered report style article. So this is an open research kind of publishing format whereby your project undergoes peer review before you do your data analysis. I'm not going to go into too much more detail than that, just in the interest of time, but very happy to have a chat about doing a registered report as part of a PhD. I think it's been it's been a lot of work, but a really good experience, and definitely strengthened the study, because I'm currently working on revisions from reviewers on my data analysis plan. So I actually haven't done my analysis yet, but it's been wonderful to get feedback at this stage. So we're using a smaller sample of ABCD just so that we have data from people for kind of our time points of interest. So we're looking to see, our first hypothesis is looking at, or is hypothesizing that earlier pubertal timing at year 1, so when the young people are aged 10 to 11, is associated with higher depressive symptoms at year 3, when the young people are aged 12 to 13. And then our second hypothesis is that the relationship between pubertal timing and depressive symptoms will be mediated by specific brain structures measured at year 2. So this is our mediation model setup, which will test using structural equation modeling, and then we'll use nested linear effects model to look at the other associations. And the regions of interest that we identified emerged from pilot we did using a sample of the ABCD study. Which I suppose is just kind of was very useful for our purposes, and I suppose just highlights one advantage of using large existing data sets, so that you can use a small sample of 1,000 people at the 10% of the sample to kind of identify and inform your hypotheses. So this is one that I'll continue working on for at the moment, and hopefully submit next week submit the revisions next week. And then the third project I'd like to discuss briefly today is my data collection based project. So this is quite different to the other research I've been discussing, in that rather than working with a sample of 12,000 people, we're working with a sample of 30. And these were young people based in Edinburgh that we recruited last year. So the kind of main aim of this study was to better understand the neural correlates of irritability in adolescent depression. So what I mean by this is we know that irritability is a core symptom of depression in adolescents, and it's also a risk factor for emotion regulation problems. But you know, what's going on in the brain when young people are irritated isn't very well understood. And I think this is due to a lot of reasons. You know, irritability isn't just a symptom of depression, it co-occurs in lots of other mental health difficulties. And then there's a variety of measures that are used to try and study irritability. But kind of the main gap in the literature that we identified is that when people have tried to understand irritability in the past, the social context of irritability has been overlooked. So if you look at the neuroimaging studies, a lot of the time the participant is, you know, undergoes an MRI scan and then they're asked to solve an impossible maths problem. And that's kind of the way of inducing an irritated state. And while that will probably make everyone frustrated, for our purposes, especially studying irritability within adolescence, you know, the social context is so important because, you know, a young person's experience of irritability is very much rooted in their social world. So what we wanted to do is to try and study irritability bearing this kind of social importance in mind. And we developed a kind of new fMRI task working with young people to develop this task so that it kind of reflected the lives of young people as much as possible. And then we piloted this in a small sample of young people. And so this analysis is kind of currently underway, but I'll kind of briefly walk you through what we found to date. So this is just an example of the kinds of scenarios that people will read when in the scanner. So I find it irritating when people tell me to do something even though I was going to do it. And this is just some kind of basic information on our sample. So this is just the analysis that we've done to date. So we adopted a graph theory approach. And essentially what this does is it models the brain as a network consisting of nodes and edges. So if you can see here in the diagram, you've got different nodes of kind of function and then how they relate to other nodes within the brain. And then the edges are kind of the connections between these nodes. And you can use these network properties to kind of investigate different properties of these networks. So you can see how well they kind of talk to each other or how connected they are. And one approach that we took was to look at the kind of integration of these networks. And this is something that's measured using an approach or using a metric called clustering coefficient. So we found that higher irritability was associated with increased dominance of an area of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. So this is really important for emotion regulation. And we found that this had increased dominance over a fragmented network. So there was a kind of so if you see here in the diagram of the nodes and the edges, there were less triangles. So there was less kind of neighboring nodes. It was a fragmented network. So this kind of highlights the important role of this region and its connections in the kind of neurobiology of irritability. And this is very recent work that we've done over the last few weeks. And we're going to follow this up with some more analysis, looking at the kind of dynamic nature of brain activity in the context of irritability. So I know I'm kind of coming up to time, if not over time, but just to so yeah, as Heather mentioned, this is my last year of my PhD, so I'm due to submit at the end of the year. And my main priority over the next couple of months will just be finishing up the registered report and the irritability project and submitting them for publication. And also another kind of review paper that we've worked on with a young person, which is kind of we're preparing for submission at the moment, as well as attending some conferences. And then submitting the thesis by the end of the year. And then just briefly mention some other activities which Mental Health UK helped support. So just to kind of highlight one, I suppose, was that I was invited to visit Professor Christian Tamnis's group in Oslo last November, which was a fantastic opportunity, and was very thankful for MHR UK to support the trip. And then, as Heather mentioned, good news last week that from the BNA that I've been awarded highly commended in the student researcher category. So that was really nice, I suppose, as an opportunity to reflect on the open research that I've done in my PhD to date, and the how it's shaped my approach to research. So to finish, I just like to say a huge to my supervisors and collaborators here in Scotland, and yeah, open up for any questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Niamh. Great stuff. Would you like to take down your, yeah.
Sorry, I was a bit over time.
Don't worry. We've got a bit of extra time because I didn't witter on at the beginning. So Peter, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, Niamh, but I just wondered whether you could tell us a little bit more about the registered report approach, because I think it's really important. And also the ABC study is open data, designed to be open. And before the registering of your report, how do you know, or how do you find out about whether other people around the globe are using the same data set to do something similar? And are you able to communicate with them and synthesize or compare and contrast your data?
Yeah, great question. Thanks very, very much, Peter. So to answer your first question, so yeah, I didn't go into too much detail about the registered report because I feel like you can give like a whole lecture on what a registered report is. But so for those of you that don't know, it's a publishing format that kind of promotes open science. So rather than having all of the peer review at the end of your article, it splits it into two parts. So what you do is you write your introduction and a very detailed methods and data analysis plan, and then that's submitted to a journal for peer review. So you get feedback on your proposed plans before you do your analysis. And then if you like address their concerns, and like from my experience, we got lots of really positive feedback on the paper and really helpful and constructive feedback, and kind of highlighted things that maybe we didn't think of, or kind of it's great because you get like other experts feedback on your project, and then they give you the opportunity to kind of shape it and strengthen the project. So I'm just kind of at that stage now and preparing to resubmit, and then hopefully I'll be issued something called an in-principle acceptance. So that means that regardless of what I find when I do my analysis, as long as I stick to my kind of registered plan, they'll publish my findings. So it's kind of a way that kind of, I suppose, gives the researcher reassurance that like even if your findings aren't significant, that they'll still be published. And I suppose it just kind of stops reduces the presence of p-hacking and hypothesizing after the results are known, and it's just a very transparent way of doing research. I think in terms of the experience of it, it's quite like a front-loaded workflow. So like you do a lot of work now, but I'm hoping that because you literally know exactly how you're going to do every aspect of your study, it will make the kind of data analysis part of the project a bit more straightforward. I will say that I think it's a lot easier to do a registered report with secondary data sets like ABCD, because having collected data as well, the plan you have at the start versus like in terms of what data you're going to collect versus the sample you're actually able to recruit can be quite different, and that's through no fault of your own. I think that's just life as a researcher collecting data. Yeah, so I won't say much more on that, but the second point then in terms of ABCD. So yeah, I think when you work with a freely available data set like ABCD, there's always going to be risk of overlap. I think ABCD have done a very good job at like documenting who's researching what. So they really encourage all researchers to pre-register their analysis and try and do registered reports if you can. On their website, they have like a list of all of the studies that have already been published, and then they also encourage people to like upload kind of protocols to the open science framework and things like that. And I didn't go into detail in my presentation, but I was part of a kind of ABCD summer school last year that was kind of like highlighting collaboration and kind of working together. So they really have tried to make sure that everyone's working together rather than being super competitive. And we've actually written a protocol paper together on that, which kind of is a user guide for ABCD. So that was linked to my slides. So maybe they'll be available afterwards.
Sounds a really important experience in your PhD studies. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that's okay. Alarmingly, I see that this session is ending in 20 seconds. It's a bit earlier than I anticipated, but I think there might have been some behind the scenes maneuvering, which I only. But thank you very much, Niamh, for that talk. It was really excellent to see your work, and thank you to all the speakers.